Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Allissa W. I am Dene Menominee Nations, and I use she, her pronouns. I am with the Center for Economic Inclusion, and I brought these wonderful people here together for all of you to have this Activator Lab. Panelists, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Bonjour. Indinui Maganaduk, Nikki Indigenous, Makwanduda, Monomini, Zaki, Gung, and Dunjaba. So hello, relatives. So far as I can see, I recognize some of the names in the participant list. I'm Nikki, and I'm Bear Clan, and I'm from the beautiful Lake Vermilion side of the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa. So my home community is in northern Minnesota, but I'm coming to you live here from my home office in Minneapolis, and I'm the managing director for Indian Fund, which is the lending arm of Indian Collective, and we're an emerging national native CDFI that's going to provide financing and capacity building to large-scale development projects in Indian country in the areas of renewable energy, infrastructure, social enterprise, regenerative ag, community development, and housing. And we're vetting them through a due diligence process that honors Indigenous economic principles, resilience, recovery, and regeneration. And I think Indian Collective's mission, our theory of change, is based around what we're calling now the 3Ds: defend, develop, decolonize. And this is all built around, we joke, our fearless leader, Nick's vision to have an entire organism and ecosystem that serves really as a toolbox for self-determination for Indigenous peoples. So I have a lot that I would like to say, but I guess to not make my intro too long-winded, I guess what I'll say is, what's unique about Indian Collective is really that our philanthropic work and our investment work, they're directly connected to Indigenous movement building work. So our people, right, we're on the front lines of some of the most pressing issues facing humanity: climate justice, just transition from fossil fuels, racial equity. And what we built at Indian is an extension of that overarching movement. So our investments are in direct relationship with these pressing issues. And we have guardrails, right, around the types of projects we'll invest in, and they must align with just transition, social, racial, and climate equity. But that being said, we don't have guardrails necessarily around like the type of capital that we can source and bring in. So really our entire ecosystem allows us to bring in the right capital for the right project. And prior to joining Indian Collective, I used to work with, and they're going to do their intro soon when I be quiet. I used to work with Casey at the Center for Indian Country Development, where among other things, I got to research and engage, right, stakeholders and decision makers on these issues surrounding capital access for Native communities. And before that, I had chartered and ran a federal credit union for my home community here in Minnesota. And so what I can appreciate now, working, at the grassroots level and the national systems-based approaches, and now with an organization that's dedicated to disrupting in a good way the systems of capitalism and oppression through movement building and through influencing, right, the spaces we're not previously invited into, is that Indigenous people and people of color, right, like we need it all. So we need organizations like the CICD to help gather the data and info so we're not invisible to policymakers. But we need our people to be leading change in their own communities, and history shows the power of grassroots and social movements. So with all of that, I'm excited to be here today with these other change makers and with you out in our virtual audience. Chimagwich.
Well, quite an intro, Nikki. Tough, always tough to follow you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Lozar, and I'm coming to today's event from Helena, Montana, where I have the opportunity to work with the Federal Reserve and have the opportunity to lead the Center for Indian Country Development. I'm about depending on how fast you drive, about 2 hours and 42 minutes away from my reservation in Western Montana, the Flathead Reservation, where I'm an enrolled member of the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. So excited to be at the Federal Reserve and honored to be working with a Center for Indian Country Development, which, as Nikki mentioned, we're a research institute that's was really put in place to help address some of the data deserts that exist in Indian country, particularly around issues around access to capital and financing in Indian country, investments in Indian country. We have over the years, I think we've been working in Indian country for 40 or 50 years here at the Minneapolis Fed. Just 5 years ago, we sort of formalized our commitment to Indian country. We had some major initiatives around sort of helping to build Indian business alliances around the 6 states in our district, really helping to support intermediaries and tribal entrepreneurs to have kind of a go-to resource in their community to help grow and expand the goods and services that they want to be able to provide in their community. And we've also done some work around and we continue to do work around legal infrastructure, just to make sure that our tribal governments are thinking about the implications of the role of legal infrastructure and how that aligns with essentially sort of playing the game with the non-Indian investors, in particular in financial institutions, to provide some certainty around financing in Indian country. Over the past few years, we've had a significant effort underway around tribal home ownership. So really doing research and doing some coalition building to really help Indigenous people realize that dream of owning their own home in the place where they want to be. And it's been certainly an exciting and a difficult effort to sort of move forward that space, and we see ourselves as being in the sandbox on all of these initiatives, not necessarily owning the sandbox. I think as a non-Indian institution and quasi-federal institution, I think we're really here to listen to the needs of Indian country from the research and data side, and try to get our wickedly smart people at the table to do the research that will help move forward conversations at the tribal level, policy conversations at state and federal level. So it's a really interesting and unique center for the Federal Reserve, and we hope to continue to expand the research based on conversations like the conversations today, like what is needed and how can we be helpful to really arm tribal leaders with more information to help drive the investments that they envision for their community. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be joining you all this morning.
Ampetu washte everyone. Yushki and wachian kapie. Washichu ia Carly Bad Herpel and Makiapie. Dakota ia Tokada Kimaniwi Mie. Wakpa ipaksha hemataha. Minnesota makoche hemataha. Da makota, bade wakanto hemata. Nakum bade ota otui der watie. So hello, good day, friends and relatives. Happy to see you all today. I introduce myself to you in my language, the Dakota language, which is the indigenous language of this land where I live, and of my people who come from this place. And I know we have a lot of Minnesota folks on the call today. In English, I shared that my name is Carly Bad Herpel. In Dakota, my name is Tokada Kiamaniwi, or Woman Who Walks Toward the Future. I am a citizen of the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe in South Dakota. But again, my people come from right here in Minnesota Makoche, or the land where the water reflects the sky, also commonly known as Minnesota. But that's our word for this place. I am of the Spirit Lake Dweller people, or Bade-Wakantua band. And I live here in Minneapolis, or Bade-Oto-Otue, City of Many Lakes. So that's a little bit about who I am. I'm also a former program officer. I worked in philanthropy for 6 years at the Bush Foundation, specifically started with our work in education and then moved over across the foundation and worked in all of our program areas on our work in Indian country. So across the programs of the foundation in and with the 23 Native nations in their service area. I'm also a former attorney. I went to the University of Minnesota Law School and worked in child welfare for a while, and a former Dakota language teacher. So every now and then I might share some words. That's a big part of who I am, and my passion is trying to elevate the importance of our culture and our language here in our homelands. Currently, I'm the executive director of an organization called the Native Ways Federation. So we were founded by 7 national Native nonprofits: Native American Rights Fund, American Indian Science and Engineering Society, American Indian College Fund, Association of American Indian Affairs, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, Running Strong for American Indian Youth, and First Nations Development Institute. So those 7 organizations started coming together around 10 years ago, and with some common agenda items, and did some work together over the past 10 years. And then this past April asked me if I would come in and really take the work to the next level. So now we're operating as our own entity, and excited to be doing this work. And what is this work? Our mission is focused on expanding and activating informed giving to Native nonprofits. So we're really focused on how to get more support for Native-led organizations, in part through donor education and advocacy. And so there is this external kind of component, but there's also an internal component where we're really looking at, which is I'm really excited about, the idea of strengthening the circle of uniting Native organizations to be able to be effective organizations on our own terms. So we're looking to be a resource and a bridge across the sector and in support of the strengthening of the Native nonprofit sector as a whole, and again, looking to do it on our terms. So we have a lot of nonprofit assessment organizations out there who tell us this is what an effective organization looks like, and we're really interested in taking this work to the next level where we can be like, well, actually, this is what an effective organization looks like from an Indigenous perspective that more aligns with Indigenous values. And so we're on that journey, and it's tough work, but I think it's an important work, especially as we look at connected to what we're talking about today, which I think has a lot to do with we're living in this broader kind of individualistic society, and how can we get back to as Indigenous people, organizations, leaders, to really understanding the broader landscape of what are our roles, how can we work together, how can we lift each other up, and how can we change these systems so that we're able to thrive, so that we're able to function in a way that best serves us and best serves our communities. So I'm really happy to be here today, happy to be on this panel with these really cool people who are doing amazing work at their own organizations, and excited to hear from the audience as well.
So I think that leaves me. I'm John Lewis. I am not from Minneapolis. I'm not from Minnesota. I'm not from the Midwest. I do a couple different things. I am actually from the Gila River Indian community, which is located right next to Phoenix here in Arizona. I'm an appointed official for the community. I'm currently the vice chair for Gila River Telecommunications. So we have a telecommunications corporate board. So I sit on the board. I've been doing that for about 8 years. I just stepped off serving as the chairman for our electric utility here at Gila River. I did that for almost 12 years. We have a pretty significant sized electric utility here that serves the community. So I'm very involved at Gila River. The connection probably to Minneapolis and the Midwest is I do work for a company called Avant Energy. So they're based in Minneapolis. located downtown. So we operate a FERC trading room. So we sell electricity and we trade natural gas. We buy and sell electricity, but we also have a consulting division. So I lead, I'm one of the managing directors for this consulting division. So we work with tribes on energy and infrastructure issues, a lot of trying to develop a lot of renewables. That's what I do with tribes. I work with, 10 tribes in California and some tribes in Washington State. I work in the Southeast. I do a lot of work in New Mexico with some of the pueblos in New Mexico. Work with a lot of tribes here in Arizona, and then obviously up in Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Midwest. We have a lot of clients there. So we do a lot of electric utility negotiations and it's a lot of actually just business management for tribes to kind of build up their capacity to start taking on generation projects like renewables and managing their electric consumption. And then there's this climate action initiative that we're really trying to push. And so I think that's where these partnerships come in. So I really appreciate being invited by Allissa to the panel. And I feel very blessed to be on the panel with these folks who I really do want to connect with them after the panel. I think that partnerships is a key thing. So the third thing I do, probably the third bucket, is what I do for the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. I'm the chair for their TNAC committee. So it's a Tribal Nations Advisory Committee. So I work directly with Sarah Echohawk. So she's the executive director for ACES. They're based in Colorado. And it's a STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics curriculum that we developed at Gila River for our youth. And so we initially developed for high school age and then college age, and then we went in reverse and did it for 5th to 8th graders. And so the curriculum that we developed at Gila River, the STEM curriculum, incorporated language and culture. So we made it a STEAM initiative. The A would be cubed if you wrote it out. So the A would include, we added arts, architecture, and agriculture because that's traditional to us at Gila River. And so that's what we've tried to instill in our 5th to 8th graders. So we've been doing this. And so now that COVID this pandemic has affected everybody, it's in a way, it's actually made some of this initiative that we worked on at Gila River, and now we're trying to, I guess, make this initiative and this curriculum available to other tribes throughout Indian country. It's a little easier now because everyone's so into Zoom meetings and online discussion. And so rather than have a physical group of 10 kids every summer, we can do this year round. And so what I guess the interaction with this STEM program at Gila River and ACES is that we really want to produce a curriculum or a template that can be adopted by tribes wherever they are and incorporate their own language and culture into that. But then also, some tribes have the wherewithal to pay for this stuff and some don't. And so a lot of what I do is partnerships and connecting corporate America to tribes. And so I think, as everyone kind of mentioned and touched on, it's a very delicate conversation to be had. Corporations don't know who tribes are. They don't understand what they are. They don't know who to talk to. They may Google a tribe and call the main number or the main administrative, whoever answers the phone, and that's their experience working with tribe. They don't know who that is. They think that probably there's some kind of primitive organization in place, and that's not really true anymore. We have very sophisticated governments and tribal business entities. And so I think that's on one end. That's corporate America, I think, is interested in working with tribes. I think there's a lot of perceived risk. And so I feel like the partnership development that I do is trying to minimize that risk. On the tribal side, I do tell the folks I work with, you got to get your ducks in a row because corporate America can't read your mind. So you can't expect them to understand you and understand what you need and require. So you have to tell them. And so a lot of that is in-house, internally getting your ducks in a row, getting things in place so that if you are engaged in a partnership with someone like Intel or Google, you can offtake that as a two-way kind of relationship. And so that's some background on myself, and I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for your introductions. And I think that's a great segue into our first question. Why is it easier for Indigenous peoples and organizations to access philanthropy versus investments?
Well, I was actually thinking, and thank you, Alyssa, since we said we might do this a little bit free form, I think John, if it's okay, we can definitely get to that, but I think John hit on a good thing where he was talking about, right, the perceived risk. And he gave us one answer to another question we were thinking of throwing out there to everyone. And maybe, Alyssa, if you didn't mind dropping it in the chat, but I think it was like, why do we think funders and investors, right, don't directly invest, right, into Indigenous-led organizations and businesses? So one hint, John gave us the answer to one of them, right, which is there's this perceived risk. And I won't get on my soapbox about what that perception is. Is it real? Is it perceived? What parts of it do tribes need to do to meet corporate America, to meet private investment halfway? And then what do investors and funders need to do to come halfway on their side? Because it's never that. Like, it almost experientially, we can all say it's never that. We have to speak the investing lexicon and we have to enter those spaces, but there's never that, or rarely, and it's changing, a shared understanding. But I'm going to be quiet because I'll be long-winded, but I do appreciate John maybe kicking us off with that, kind of leading us to that question first. Thanks, Alyssa. So I guess we're just having you maybe type in your responses into the Zoom chat. And this is really just to kind of gauge where we're all at too in this conversation together today.
And I can just share, as folks are thinking about, we really do want, if you have some ideas, if you can put them in the chat, we'd love to hear from other folks. And I can share, a few of my thoughts too, as somebody that's worked in philanthropy and is now working for an organization that is focused on supporting Native-led organizations. It's already been touched on by John and Nikki, but this idea that there's so much that people don't know about Native people, communities, tribes. This country has done a terrible job of educating folks about our people, about our communities. We've seen, there was that Reclaiming Native Truth study that came out a couple of years ago. One of the statistics in there, and that was funded by Kellogg Foundation. And one of the statistics that has been widely shared from that work was that based on the national survey that they did, 40% of the folks they surveyed didn't know that Native people still exist. They knew that we existed at one time, but we're oftentimes the people of the past. There was another study, I think it was from NCAI, that came out that shared that out of state history standards across the country, 89% of state history standards have no mention of Native people, communities, people post 1900. So basically, we were here, we existed, and then we're gone. That's not our story. That's not our narrative. That's the dominant narrative that has been shared, and as a result, we're struggling with folks not having information, not having understanding of some of our issues and where they've come from, and how to step in. I hear that a lot. I hear a lot from foundations and other folks saying, we want to support Native people, we just don't know how, or we don't have a program area for that. You don't need a program area. If you do, that's great. It's great to have an intentional program area to support Native communities. But if you don't, whatever area you're working in, whether it's education, leadership, climate change, environment, there's always space where folks should be investing in Native organizations and in Native leaders, and from a Native perspective. So one of the reasons Native Ways Federation was started is the fact that across the board, when you look at least from the philanthropy perspective, the funding that is going into Native communities, the large scale investments, so the grants over $400,000, the multi-year investments are going to non-Native led organizations. They're not going directly into the organizations who best know how to serve our communities. And that's a problem. And so that's, again, part of the reason I think, you know, on why this question was asked, but I know it's bigger than philanthropy. It's across multiple sectors. You know, why is it that folks haven't reached out, aren't directing their attention to Indigenous-led? Is it this lack of understanding, this lack of education? And then it gets to like, okay, maybe, but then once you know, right? And you got to do something about it. There's an accountability factor. So we're trying to help figure out what are those next steps and how can we help to operationalize and make some of this happen.
Yeah, just to maybe add on to several of Carly's points and something you brought up, John, just in terms of kind of where to start in Indian country. I mean, I think all of us on the panel and our colleagues around the country probably spend a portion of every day doing Indian Education 101, and that's just part of our job. And there's just so many different myths and misconceptions about that Indian country that we sort of have to battle on a day-to-day basis. And for folks who are unfamiliar with Indian country, you know, there's this level of anxiety, just really starting with the basic fact of like, are you guys Native Americans? Do we call you American Indians? Are you Native American Indians? Or, you know, we've heard like 50 million different concerns about the, you know, how do we refer, what do we refer to you as? And that's obviously a difficult starting point. But like any, when you think about it from an investment perspective and investing in Indian country, like any investment, you do your due diligence, right? If you're not aware of a certain funding stream or a certain asset or whatnot, you spend the time to truly do the due diligence. And in Indian country, to partner in Indian country, due diligence is really relationship building and putting yourself out there, and not feeling like due diligence is not sending that letter to the tribal council member or the tribal chair and saying, what the heck, never heard back, so I guess they're not interested. Or as John mentioned, calling the main line for the tribe. Like that's not due diligence. You got to go many steps beyond that. And there are 577 tribes, and all of them are very different. The structures are different. The ways in engaging with each of the tribes may be different, but what's not different for folks outside of Indian country is the time, the energy that needs to go into relationship building and trust building, so that there is this mutual relationships and this mutual understanding, or that effective due diligence that you can find to be able to start as the platform for investing in Indian country. I spent quite a bit of my career working with the American Indian College Fund and the notably the Third Foundation, working in the philanthropic world. And I feel like the donors that provided resources beyond what Carly said, beyond that 400,000, or those that were willing to go with larger multi-year donations or funds, really were the ones who invested staff and time to go to tribal communities, to have those personal relationships, to know tribal families, and to really kind of be on the ground and listen, understand in a really humble way. And I think you can't really have meaningful investment if that isn't accomplished. So I really, that's the one thing I would really urge. I think that's sort of missing in this question here, and really at the very core of the question. that there's a disconnect between investing in Indian country because there's a disconnect in relationship building. So I would really highly encourage those that are interested in doing work in Indian country to really spend the time to ask dumb questions, to feel vulnerable in the initiation of your relationships with tribal leaders and tribal people.
Yeah, snaps to both of what you shared, and I know it's hard to do the engagement just via Zoom chat, so I'm seeing that looks kind of blank, but maybe we can keep pushing forward. But just thinking about what each of you said, at Indian, we did our own like temperature checking, right, with like bellwethers, so those that are on all different sides of the equation around both philanthropy and investing. And a lot of it was lack of knowledge. So I mean, just underscoring what Carly was saying, but even those that were like really engaged and woke, and they're in this walk in partnership with us, they still seemed leery or reticent or even scared, whatever the appropriate word is, right, to really invest and give up the locus of control over the investment. So what makes us hopeful is we're seeing more of a shift in to what is really self-determination, right? Like, we're not going to make you conform to like our, grant performing standards. We're going to let you decide your project outcomes. We're going to, kind of be more hands-off, especially with intermediaries like NDN or those like Allissa Corporation, which represents the native CDFIs. We're seeing more of that, so that's hopeful, but there is definitely a reticence there. So maybe instead of just, maybe we can shift towards more of kind of that forward thinking. So that's a bit of the landscape, but what do we need to like reclaim, right? Our traditions so that we can build that economic power. What does that look like? Really existential, right? But what does that look like? Because it is practical too.
To me, it's a shift in worldview, and really having a good understanding of Indigenous worldview can be helpful to our people and also to others. You talk about risk. Let's have real conversations about risk and how risk assessments are determined. And because for folks, from my experience working in philanthropy, oftentimes when we talk about risk, the less risky organizations are these white-led organizations who have been getting lots of money for a long time, and we haven't been seeing the benefits from it. In fact, if anything, our communities have been further disenfranchised. And so let's talk about risk. Why is that considered less risky than investing in community-led organizations who are the ones closest to the issues? And yeah, there may be some due diligence, like Casey was talking about, that needs to happen around figuring out, what are some different ways we can support. And that's the other thing, looking at monetary investment is super, super, super important. And how can other resources be utilized, including relationship building, networking, making sure that we have Native representation at multiple tables where decision making is happening. And all of this is leading toward, the idea of, we need to be having different conversations about what is wealth, what does it mean to be wealthy, right? And one of the things I wanted to share. So my name is Carly Eastman. My grandfather was Charles Eastman. One of my grandfathers, or Ohiesa, he was one of the first Native people to become a formally Western trained doctor. And he was from here, right here, Minnesota Makoche. I will share the first person to become, my understanding, to become a Western trained doctor, which I think is pretty cool, was actually a woman, Susan Peacock. But he was a prolific writer. So Charles, Grandpa Ohiesa, he was a prolific writer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he wrote about what it was like to grow up in Minnesota, living off the land, then to be exiled. Our people were exiled from the state of Minnesota following the war of 1862, which is why my tribe is in South Dakota. His writings largely focus on this idea of trying to live in these two worlds, you know, going through Western formal education systems, obtaining this medical degree, but also maintaining a connection to his traditional upbringing and values. You know, one of the things that he wrote was, and this is a quote, "It was our belief that the love and possessions is a weakness to be overcome. Its appeal is to the material part, and if allowed its way, it will in time disturb one's spiritual balance. Therefore, children must early learn the beauty of generosity. They are taught to give away what they prize most, and that they may taste the happiness of giving." He went on to say that Native folks literally give away all that they have to relatives, to guests, to other tribes, or to clans, but of all else to the poor and to the aged, from whom they can hope for no return. So in his writings, he was sharing about our traditional leadership, our relationship models, which instilled in us the importance of recognizing our roles and strengths in society, but not for our personal benefit in and of itself, but for the benefit of the whole. And that's something that's missing. You know, in this country, economic power, wealth building, you know, it's often determined by the amount of money that someone has, not necessarily about their ability to care for the needs of the community. And from an Indigenous perspective, you know, there's a lot to be learned here. And many of us believe that in these concepts of living in balance, in relationship with one another, of having the resources and the means to take care of each other so that we can not just survive, but thrive. There's a lot to be learned there, and a lot that Native folks want and need to be able to be successful, but also on a broader scale as well.
Yeah, I'll just kind of jump in. I mean, I think all the thoughts that have been shared thus far have been pretty. I think it's very interesting. I think we're all kind of. I think each one of these panelists, we're in the same universe. We're just in different places. And Indian country is a big universe. I mean, it's a big universe in a way where there's a lot of different things going on, because there's gaming, right? There's gaming regulatory. There's the gaming business. So there's a huge revenue economic engine, you know, and then there's the government, the tribal governance part. And so there, you know, that has to do with, you know, land and the trust issues and language and culture, and then healthcare. And healthcare is now, it's the biggest component right now, arguably, the healthcare architecture that tribes, you know, that's built out for tribes, or that tribes have built out for themselves. If they're self-governance tribes, then they manage their own healthcare budgets. If they're not, then they're, you know, working directly with the federal government through IHS and through whatever. Usually they're called 638 agreements to do self-governance activities. So there's all these different things, and then you have, you know, all these. There's a social component, and so I think it's very, we're all in different parts of the Indian country is small, but the universe is big still. And it's kind of funny that we're operating in the same space. And I don't know the panelists very well. I've heard their names, but, you know, I think it's interesting that we're all trying to do the same thing, I think, from different angles, different perspectives. You know, one thing I think that was mentioned is, because I do a lot of work, again, in infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy. So those are very capital intensive. They require a lot of work and resources. And so those are long-term commitments. These, you know, you build a substation to get energy delivered to your tribal community. You know, there's a lot of work that goes into that. Those are long-term lease agreements or long-term financing. You know, you're talking 20 to 30 years. You want to build a solar project. Usually the solar project has what's called a power purchase agreement. That's typically 20 to 30 years, 25 to 30 years. So in the the part of the sectors that I work in, telecom and energy and infrastructure, these are very long-term, heavy commitment kind of activities, and they're very high. They require a lot of capital, a lot of funding, a lot of money. And so how you get to that point where you can actually develop something at the tribal level, however it originated, it takes a lot of work. And so that's one thing I think, doing business within Indian country, there is this long ramp to get to where, you know, you're actually executing on a project, right? And so that's, I will say, I think from an outsider's perspective, that's probably non-Indian, they're very, it's frustrating, you know. But on the other side, you're dealing with tribal governments that have, you know, there has been it has not been a fair process for tribal governments, and then the way the U.S. tax code impacts tribes, what they can and can't do. I mean, the system is it's a ever-changing landscape for tribes to try to, you know, get to the point where there's a plateau, you could do something, and then it, you know, the regulatory system changes again. Right now in Arizona, there's a big case in state court that has to do with how tribes are taxed for permanent improvements, which could be energy projects, pipelines, transmission projects, and so that makes that one court case now makes some of the projects, solar projects that a tribal client of mine is involved with, uneconomical. And it's simple things like that. It's governments, the tribal government, and the authority that tribal governments have on and off reservation, that's constantly under attack. And so it's very difficult to, I guess, to conduct business and then do things that are long-term, meaningful projects for your people, and to bring improved wireless connectivity to the internet, and reliable, affordable power. All those things are constantly, it's very difficult to on one hand wage, you know, put up some legal battle with the state constantly, but also work with a government that has not historically been fair and sometimes unreasonable administrative rulings and decisions that they make, and then also grow economically. It's very difficult to do all those things at the same time. So I think that's one kind of area I think that I think deserves a little more attention. And I think this panel, you know, I think each of these panels probably have a lot to say on that kind of thing. It's a very it's always an uphill battle. It's always a fight. And so I think in that kind of sense, when you're trying to do some short-term things, you know, that's one thing. And that's, you know, short-term things, small grants, you know, under $100,000, trying to do, you know, I guess provide support for some kind of social program or something. That's one thing. But long-term commitments, long-term obligations, and then you start bringing in, you know, I guess agreements and covenants with outside lenders and different authority agents. It's very difficult. And so tribes really, they'd have to have a lot of funding. They'd have to have staff with the experience level to navigate those kind of things. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just setting the table for many tribes are in that situation where, you know, they want to do, you know, if the question is what is wealth, I mean, I would probably say that wealth, a component of wealth, not what wealth entirely is, but a component could be decision making and having some kind of authority to make decisions. And so I think that's self-reliance. If you're able to make decisions and you're able to have an authority to some extent to make yourself self-reliant, whether that's from outside funding, whether that's in my case that I work in. I have an issue with investor-owned utilities who dominate states, and they work with tribes, they serve tribes, but you know, the tribe will always remain a retail customer when they can be a wholesale participant. That's the world I work in, and it's very difficult. But I think that you know, it's very, in my mind, it's hard for a tribal government to say they're self-reliant if they're constantly at the mercy of an outside utility, where that utility is serving electricity to their gaming facility or their tribal government or their people, to their residents. So, you know, there is this power play of decision making. I think that's a component of wealth that needs to be more fleshed out. You know.
I think to add on to that, I think that the point you're making around sort of decision making, both at the tribal level and with partners that are engaging in Indian country is really important in terms of reclaiming our traditions for generating wealth and economic power. I kind of go back to when I was a little kid, and I remember one of the elders in our community was telling a story about a buffalo hunt, and you know, we're generally from the mountain region in Montana or around Montana and Idaho and up into Alberta and BC. But this elder was kind of walking through the whole process for the hunt, right? So when, you know, there were scouts out looking for herds, you know, hundreds of miles away, you know, signaling back, you know, when was the right time to head out on the hunt. This whole structure that was put into place of how many folks would need to go on the hunt, what their specific roles were, what the timelines and deadlines would be, how many buffaloes should be harvested based on the individual needs of their band or their community. How would we transport the meat and the hides back to our families? And it was this incredibly complex and data-driven process that was very much inherent to our people. That is, I think, at the very core of the sort of really moving our communities forward, and particularly, as both John and Carly mentioned, thinking about that long-term society, the long-term nation that we want to be, and really relying on the data that we've always relied upon to care for our communities and to reach those sort of community goals that we've set. And that's one of the things that I think when you look at some of the tribes who've done an incredible job during the self-determination era, there's been a bit of a sort of pause within those tribes to really stop and reflect on what do we want to be? How do we want to provide for our communities? As opposed to that quick, let's dive into and sort of chase down whatever federal programs we can have. We've got a deadline or a short grant because we have a really immediate need. I think the tribes who have been the most successful for creating what would be more of balanced wealth or well-being in our community have really reflected on the data and the direct stories from tribal members and from their communities to build out a larger plan about where they want to be. And data is really at the center of it. I think of one example is Lada del Sur down in New Mexico, or down in Texas, one of the pueblos. They have done what is something like an annual socio-economic profile for their community. And it's kind of built off of a little bit of census and how that's put together. But they've been doing it pretty consistently over the past 12 to 15 years or so. And there's some really rich information that they collect every year on the needs of their communities. And then they build out the programming and their government services to really meet their tribal members where they're at. For example, there was a large portion of their community that had credits but didn't have a credential or have a degree, and so they built a kind of a whole program around how to support their tribal members to get back into higher education or set them up for that credential. And they lean on data to really design that program. And so I think data, even though I say we live in a data desert, and in many ways we do from the sort of mainstream world perspective, we have an incredible amount of data that drives decisions in Indian country. And I think continuing to fine tune how we collect that data and respond and create and make those decisions for the long term for our community is absolutely critical for building balanced wealth and long-term wealth, however that is defined in our tribal community. So I guess I would underscore that that importance of research and data, and then leveraging data to inform decision making.
Thank you. I'll just kind of jump in, and I always like to shake things up. So because we're invisible, right? Because it's so rare that that data is disaggregated. I remember, I'll say this, Casey, being at the Fed, the FDIC asked, what can we do, right, to help channel capital and help make it more accessible? And I said, one thing would be nice is if your household survey, right, on unbanked and underbanked people continued to disaggregate, but, for Native Americans, because now we're just a asterisk and the other, I don't know why you stopped. Or when Wells Fargo asked, what can we do? We have multi-million dollars. It's like, well, you were doing mortgage lending in our communities and now you're not. So maybe, I guess it's putting your money where your mouth is, putting your resources into capturing that data. But I also think about like talking with an investor or someone that works with multiple investors, right? And fund managers. And they were hearing what we were saying, but they weren't really comprehending it. They're like, oh, do we need another white paper? And I was thinking, no, you need to start investing. Like there is enough for what to at least start. There's enough data. We know that there's billions of dollars, right, of gap that exist in infrastructure projects at these large scale. We know that for native CDFIs, there's multi-billions of dollars in gaps for their borrowers, and they focus by and large on the micro enterprise level. There's enough data to say that tribes are the rural anchors of America. So we need to invest in them because otherwise rural America is atrophying, right? And we see it in the communities that we represent and live in. We also see that in Indian country, public sector, meaning just our tribes, that's not the end and be all, right? There's enough data that shows the need for private enterprise to invest in Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs. And then what we see is that can't all be driven just by commercial lenders because there's a deficit on their end about understanding how to underwrite us. And that's their fault. That's their issue. I don't necessarily think we need to mold ourselves, that our tribes need to mold themselves to just fit whatever their underwriting criteria is. That's from the 1950s, and I don't think they've updated their policies. So I'm being hypercritical there, and it's not true for all, but it's true for many. So thinking about right, how do we do that long-term development? It's coming up with I think more creative ways to work with, right, even philanthropy, right? The foundation side, the investment arm of their institutions, because oftentimes they're not even talking to each other, right? The grant making and the investment and the program related investment side of the house, but there's ways to work with them where it provides flexible capital, where Carly just came from, right? Bush Foundation, they're doing that with us, and they're stepping back from how that money gets deployed, so that we're able to think about, it's not just about doing energy, right? It's not just about doing development. It's about how do we do it with a resilient and regenerative lens, with a 7th generation mindset, and in a way that hey, if you invest in Indigenous people, you're investing in climate justice, you're investing in all these things that social and investing folks say are important, right? And where the data comes back in too is they say it's important, but that ain't what you're investing in. So there's a disconnect between what is said and then the practice, and data plays a role in being able to shed that kind of light and help us make, better decisions together. But I do think, right, thinking about, right, there's enough climate scientists that say we're hey, possible 6th extinction coming soon. The 5th extinction were the dinosaurs. Pretty, right, sobering. And so when we think about kind of changes needed next, it's really tapping into all these different investing circles, Indigenous ways of knowing, right? Ancestral knowledge, and even some of the commercial side where we're talking about a solidarity economy. So we're talking about a transformation, right? Capitalist with the maybe lowercase c, right? In ways that, right, are balancing profitability. That's still important, but balancing it with not just blind growth, but thinking about how does this serve people, planet, and then also backing, you know, our communities, our Indigenous communities and communities of color away from thinking about scarcity. And like you, I can't remember who said it, but you're dead right. We can't be chasing federal dollars and programs, but really thinking about how we on our end too, like John was saying, prepare ourselves in a good way to receive investments. And the last thing I'll say there is the private investment community, I think they want to be here, but their biggest thing is we would love to see capacity building that helps our tribes, that helps our businesses receive these impact investments, right? That helps us meet them halfway with that investing lexicon that can get really elusive sometimes. And then how do we help ready the ground for that? So we're doing that at Indian Collective. There needs to be more of it because they want to be here. It's just, yeah, there's a disconnect in how to get here. And it is all about relationships. So that first step, putting your toe in the water, I think is the best, right? Just sending an email, picking up a phone, not to the tribal admin person, but really finding who's the best person to connect with too, I think is great. So I know we're, kind of backing up on time and we wanted to leave more for questions. We still have a whole bunch of topics we could have been getting into, but I think Allissa asked you out there in virtual world if you have any questions for us too.
As we wait for some questions to come up, just building off of what was just shared, you know, that conversation around capacity building, so often that term is determined by those in power. So one of the things we're interested in is having conversations with tribes, with Native nonprofits about what does capacity building mean to us? What does it look like to be an effective organization on our terms? And then be able to share that, because what happens is we have these initiatives that are all about capacity building, but somebody else is defining that for us, and that's problematic. And that also is somewhat related to the bigger data issue too, which is, you know, where we know that there's enough data out there to say that, you know, the need is here, and yet what I often hear is we don't have enough data about impact. You know, it's really hard to show that you're having a good impact because, you know, graduation rates look like this, or, you know, out of home placement for Native kids look like this. And again, part of the problem is who controls the data? Who's determining what success looks like in our communities? It's not us. And so how can foundations and other investors be supporting us to develop the capacity or to have what we need to have in order to collect and assess that data, or work with others to do it on our own terms, because that's something that's going to be really important. And for too long, other folks have been determining what success looks like in our communities.
I just want to give one example of that, because I think it's a really good point, Carly, in terms of what we see from Indian country of what success looks like. It may be very different than funders or corporations or whomever, but I remember I was at the American Indian College Fund, and there was always the question about graduation rates, which makes sense from folks outside Indian country. What are the graduation rates? I want to see how that compares to this organization or that organization. And the graduation rates were low. And I think we knew that, but we also knew that that wasn't the reason, primary reason for Native students going to college. And we sort of we took the time, we flipped the script, and we posed the question to thousands of Native students that we had relationships with and said, did you reach your educational goals, however you define them? 97% said yes. 97%. And to me, that is significant success versus measuring it by the sort of the mainstream model of graduation rates based on a 4-year, based on a 6-year, or so on and so forth. And I think that's the kind of question that I think folks outside of Indian country should be asking when partnering with tribal communities is, how do you define success? And how can we work together on what that success model could look like for both of us if we're going to partner together? So I think that's an absolutely critical question. Maybe outside of really starting that, dipping your toes and starting that relationship, really starting with that next question is, what does success look like to you and how can we work together?
That's a really good point. Yeah. What does success actually mean? Can they control, and can we control the outcomes? Did anyone, I feel like there's like a loud echo. Anyone, do you have any questions? There's one from Burke Murphy. She's in Red Wing, or he's in Red Wing. Wants to work with Prairie Island. What approach would be most welcome to begin the relationship?
In Red Wing, it's hard to, not having a lot of details, obviously, but the state and Red Wing locally, they have the folks they locally have relationships with the tribe. So maybe reach out and try to better understand some of those connections and reach out to the tribe. They have a great website. They have, depending on kind of the different areas that you're looking to work in and the different folks you're looking to connect with, make some phone calls. But remember, when you're doing that, if you're talking about relationship building, what exactly, what are you looking to give back? So when you reach out to folks, if you're asking something from them, make sure that there's an understanding that there's a reciprocal nature, right? That in order to enter into that relationship, that you're looking for something from them because you have something you want to give as well. And then listen, really listen to what they tell you, because it may or may not be that they have the same idea of the benefits of what you're offering, and be open to that. So really, again, it's about, what has been talked about, I think, from a number of the panelists today, but it's about relationship building. Take some steps to build those relationships. I know it's especially hard during COVID to be able to just walk into an office, but you can start with making some phone calls. You can start with better understanding the community. They have a lot of great historical information on their website about the community and how their community came to be. And the more you can better understand some of that history, the more likely that you are to move forward, I think, more quickly with being able to develop a relationship.
Yeah, and just one quick thing to add, thank you, Carly, would be sometimes with being at Indian Collective, people will find us through partners of partners, right? There's like maybe 1 or 2 degrees of separation in Indian country, and I've found that that's a really great way. So if you're looking to connect, right, with entrepreneurs, one thing I would pose is there a native CDFI in that community? Because they're going to be more accessible, I think, than like this big monolith like government, whether it's like federal, state, local, and tribal. It's hard sometimes to find the right person and to navigate that. So I would suggest starting if there is a local native CDFI. And then I would also just even feel free to reach out to myself. I'm in Minnesota, so is Carly. I know Casey's done work in Minnesota, and there might be some 1 or 2 degrees of separation that we can help with in who we know in those communities too. So I'd always say I would say do some background, some homework, but yeah, that's also a good way, is to get an intro. So I think we're coming up on time. Maybe the last thing really is kind of closing thoughts, closing comments from each of us. and just how do we invest, right? How do we collectively invest in Indian country? And then what did you want to leave as a call to action? In just a couple minutes apiece here for time. Or a minute, 60 seconds or less. There's the challenge.
I guess in addition, I think we've underscored the important role of relationship building, and I think that's the bread and butter to making strong partnerships and strong investments, period. I guess the one thing when I think about Indian country and thinking about investments and financing and partnerships, et cetera, is that investments are not one-off. That investments are investments that are going to have meaningful change. It needs to be truly an investment, not a one-time grant, or we have year-end funding, or any of those things. It's really thinking about, how do I want to invest in this community, or with this community, in partnership with this community, for 3 years, for 5 years, for 10 years. John underscored some of the big investments that are needed in Indian country, and they're big and they're meaty and they're expensive, and they are critical to advancing Native economies. And so I would really, come at it from the very beginning of, I want to start this relationship, I want to really grow my understanding of this community, but come at from the perspective of, and I want to be able to invest long term, because I think that's absolutely critical for the advancement of our communities, and the advancements of the braiding of relationships between Indian and non-Indian worlds.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I saw Nikki put your contact information. I'm going to follow suit and put mine in there. Reach out to us, reach out to Native organizations, leaders at organizations who are focused on Native issues. And we can help with making some of those connections. We're the ones and folks in our networks and in our communities, we're on the front lines of addressing the issues that have come about due to these oppressive systems that our communities face every day. And so we need to be at the table. We want to be in conversation around how to address them. And this is philanthropy, government, private investors. But first and foremost, we need to be in relationship, and we need to have representation at every table. And in every data count. We're too often left out, and that's just, it's a huge problem. And we know what we need to do. We just need to, in many ways, we need support to get some of it done, to be able to thrive. Again, not just survive, but thrive as Indigenous people. We have the answers, but we've been living, amongst these systems that have not allowed us to live the way we know that we can. And we all have, as human beings, we have this collective responsibility to care for each other, to care for the land. And now's the time, we need to be putting this into practice. We can't wait. So connect with us, let's start building some relationships, and be at the table to advocate for us and some of the work that we're trying to do as well.
I think I'm assuming most of the folks that are in the audience, they're from the non-tribal side of things, and so I think that if you're intending to work with tribal governments or tribal enterprises or tribal nonprofits, or any entity of a tribe or a tribal government, I think one thing is to just understand that every tribe is very unique and very different. Every government is different. I mean, there's a lot of, municipal governments are different, and the city and county of San Francisco operates very different from the city of Santa Fe. And it's just, these kind of things, it's the same with tribes. There is some commonality with tribes, but I think if you're trying to interact with tribes, the tribal governments have different processes, different structures, And then the enterprises are set up different. And so every tribe you would interact with would be, I don't think there's a lot of crossover. I think you really do have to, if you're really intending to work in good faith with a tribe, you're going to have to understand a lot of their tribal governments, the rules and the regulatory structure that they have in place, and their protocols. And so that's, I think a lot of folks forget that. They think that, because I've seen this a lot from the investment side of finance entities that come and want to do business with tribes. And I always hear, well, we did it with this tribe in Oklahoma, or we did it with just tribe in Washington State. Why doesn't it work here? Well, every tribe is different, even within states, even within the same region. It's very, very different and unique. So I think that's the one thing, is to have that kind of level of expectation that there is a lot of work on your end that you have to do to understand who you're going to be interacting with. So.
And thank you. I'll be 20, maybe 30 seconds. And then I would just leave it as, and if you, as an external partner, ally, or relative, want to enter these spaces and are like, hey, that's a lot of work to do that due diligence, find who the intermediaries are that are native, that could do that for you, right? So that would be not just trying to plug for Indian Collective or Indian Fund, but there are a role for intermediaries like that, and for Native CDFIs, and for other institutions. So I'd say the social and impact investing community has good buzzwords. These capital spaces have good buzzwords, but really prioritizing the organizations and the institutions that are closest to the solutions and the people would be the most important. And then ask us for our term sheets and how we can, co-develop, ways to share risk, ways to develop the loan terms, ways to develop the entire transaction and deal, because that's going to be mutually beneficial. So I'll just kind of leave it there. But yeah, thanks, Allissa, for being included today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you to all the attendees, and thank you to our panelists. If anyone has any follow-up questions or would like to get in touch with one of our panelists, go ahead and reach out to me or this center, and we'd be happy to get you in touch. And thank you again for everyone and your time.
Thank you all.
Maya, thank you, everyone.